At 9:17 on a rain-heavy Tuesday morning, HR smiled across the polished glass table and told me my raise had disappeared somewhere in legal. Around us, keyboards clicked, espresso machines hissed, and people avoided eye contact the way employees do when they already know the outcome. I laughed once, quietly closed my laptop, and walked out without arguing. Because hidden inside Contract Appendix Section 11 was a clause nobody in that building had bothered to read in 7 years. And in exactly 9 minutes, their own corporate counsel finally would. The conference room smelled like citrus disinfectant, burnt espresso, and quiet corporate panic. Not obvious panic. Not the dramatic kind with raised voices and slammed doors. This was the polished version, the expensive version, the kind wrapped in calm smiles, synchronized calendars, and people speaking softly while trying not to trigger legal liability. Outside the glass walls of the 10th floor, rain crawled down the skyline in silver lines. Downtown Chicago looked blurred and cold beneath the storm clouds, every skyscraper reflecting another like mirrors in a hall built for people who measured worth in billable hours. Inside, human resources had arranged everything perfectly. A round glass table, a printed compensation report, a tiny ceramic plant nobody watered, and across from me sat Melissa Grant, Senior HR Director, wearing a cream-colored blazer and the expression of someone rehearsed by attorneys. She folded her hands gently. "Camille," she said with professional softness, "we truly value everything you've contributed to the company." That sentence alone told me exactly where the conversation was going. People only say we value you when they're preparing to give you less. I leaned back slightly in my chair. Melissa continued carefully. "Unfortunately, your salary adjustment request encountered complications during legal review." Complications. Interesting word. Not denied. Not rejected. Complications. Behind her, through the glass corridor, employees pretended not to look inside while absolutely looking inside. Analysts slowed their walking speed. Assistants carried empty folders just to pass the room again. Corporate buildings were theaters. Everybody watched. Nobody admitted it. I glanced at the printed report in front of me. 3 years without a raise. 3 years. Meanwhile, half the licensing infrastructure of the company still ran on frameworks I had personally designed. The irony sat in the room like static electricity. Melissa slid another paper toward me. "I know this is disappointing." Disappointing. Another carefully selected word. I almost admired the craftsmanship. The company was called Halbrecht Dynamics, though internally most people simply called it HDG, Fortune 500 Partnerships. International licensing, patent distribution, medical analytics software, defense-adjacent data architecture. The kind of company where executives wore dark wool coats indoors because looking cold somehow made people seem more expensive. And for 7 years, I had built royalty optimization systems so profitable that entire divisions quietly depended on them. Not helped. Depended. There's a difference. Melissa lowered her voice sympathetically. Legal flagged some irregularities connected to compensation structures. That almost made me smile. Almost. Because legal hadn't flagged compensation. Legal had flagged ownership, and ownership inside HDG was a dangerous subject, especially when executives forgot where certain systems originally came from. A flash of lightning reflected across the windows behind her. For half a second, the room turned white, then gray again. Melissa exhaled slowly, maintaining her polished expression. We may be able to revisit this next fiscal year. There it was, the corporate lullaby. Maybe later, maybe next quarter, maybe after restructuring, maybe after performance review season, maybe after you sacrifice another year of your life. I looked down at my closed laptop. Black matte surface, tiny scratch near the hinge. 7 years old. Like me at the company. A strange thing happens after enough time inside large corporations. You stop measuring loyalty emotionally. You measure it architecturally, in access permissions, in server dependencies, in signatures buried inside forgotten contracts, in clauses nobody remembers until money starts moving. And HDG had forgotten something very important, very expensive. Melissa tilted her head gently. I hope you understand this decision isn't personal. That time, I actually laughed. Not loudly, just once. A small, quiet laugh. The kind that makes experienced executives uncomfortable because it sounds too calm. Her expression shifted slightly. What's funny? I met her eyes. The phrase, I said. I'm sorry? Lost in legal. I repeated it softly like I was tasting the words. Outside the room, someone stopped walking. Melissa's posture tightened almost invisibly. I continued. That's a very dangerous sentence in this company. For the first time, her corporate rhythm broke. Only slightly, but enough. She forced another smile. I don't think I follow. Of course she didn't. HR rarely read licensing appendices. They read behavioral policies, dress codes, termination procedures, sensitivity training modules. But contracts, real contracts, those belonged to counsel. And counsel had been asleep for years. Rain hammered harder against the windows. Somewhere down the hallway, a phone rang 3 times before stopping abruptly. I slowly closed the compensation report. Then I closed my laptop. Click. The sound seemed louder than it should have been. Melissa watched carefully now. Not relaxed anymore, not fully nervous either, just uncertain. Corporate people feared uncertainty more than anger. Anger could be documented. Uncertainty spread. You know, I said casually, 7 years ago your predecessor negotiated a temporary emergency licensing arrangement with me. Blank stare. There it was. She had no idea. None. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. The arrangement expired, she said cautiously. No, I replied. Actually, it didn't. Silence. The rain seemed louder now. Even the air conditioning hummed differently. Tiny details become enormous inside rooms where careers start tilting sideways. Melissa reached for her tablet. Professional reflex. Gather information. Regain control. But control in corporations is often an illusion created by whoever has the newest presentation slides. Real power usually lives somewhere boring, like appendix language, or payment triggers, or forgotten signatures stored in legal archives nobody has opened since the acquisition years. I stood slowly. Outside the conference room, 2 analysts immediately pretended to study a wall monitor. Cowards. Melissa's voice sharpened slightly. Camille, if there's a concern, we can schedule another meeting. I slipped the laptop into my bag. No need. You're leaving? I looked toward the storm outside. Chicago's skyline glowed silver beneath the rain like a machine made of glass and ambition. Then I looked back at her. Counsel will call you soon. That landed. Not emotionally. Professionally. Her fingers stopped moving. When exactly did legal review this issue? She asked carefully. I checked my watch. 9:17, then smiled faintly. They haven't yet. A pause. 9 minutes from now, they will. And suddenly the room felt colder. Not because of the weather, because somewhere deep inside HDG's contract archive sat Section 11 of a licensing agreement signed during a crisis acquisition 7 years earlier. A clause everyone ignored because it had never activated. A dormant thing, sleeping quietly beneath quarterly reports and executive bonuses and HR workshops, until someone said the wrong sentence. Your raise got lost in legal. I walked toward the glass doors. Behind me, Melissa finally lost the smooth HR tone. Camille. I stopped but didn't turn around. What exactly is Section 11? For a second, I just listened to the rain. Then I answered softly. The part where delayed compensation converts into royalty participation. Silence. Real silence. Not office silence. Not meeting silence. The dangerous kind. I opened the door, and somewhere upstairs on the 32nd floor, corporate counsel had just received an automated archival alert tied to my employment file, because some systems never forget, especially the ones I built myself. By 9:24 a.m., the mood inside Halbreg Dynamics had changed so subtly that most people couldn't explain it, but everyone could feel it. Corporate buildings behave strangely when invisible power shifts begin. The air changes first. Not physically, psychologically. Conversations shorten. Footsteps become faster. Assistants suddenly stop smiling in hallways. Managers begin carrying laptops against their chest like shields. People refresh inboxes more often without understanding why. And somewhere between the 26th and 32nd floors, panic had quietly entered the ventilation system. I stepped into the elevator alone. Soft instrumental jazz played overhead, absurdly cheerful for the moment unfolding upstairs. The mirrored walls reflected my expression back at me. Calm. Too calm. That's what frightened executives most. Not rage, not threats. Calm people were dangerous because they usually already knew something. The elevator stopped on 22. Two finance analysts entered mid-conversation, then froze when they recognized me. I knew both of them. Ethan from revenue forecasting, Priya from licensing compliance. Neither spoke immediately. They sensed it. People in finance always sense disturbances first. Money leaves fingerprints long before disaster becomes public. Ethan adjusted his tie awkwardly. You okay? He asked. Interesting question. Not, how did the meeting go? Not, did you get the raise? Just, you okay? Meaning rumors were already moving faster than emails. I smiled faintly. Depends how attached the company is to $81 million. Silence. Priya blinked once. Ethan actually laughed at first, the reflexive kind people use when they think something must be a joke. Then he realized I wasn't joking. The elevator suddenly felt much smaller. What does that mean? Priya asked carefully. Ding. 26th floor. The doors opened. I stepped out. You'll hear about it soon. The doors closed behind me, and through the narrowing gap, I watched both of them immediately reach for their phones. There it was. The beginning. Not the explosion. The signal before the explosion. Corporate ecosystems move like electricity. Information jumps person to person faster than official communication ever can. Especially fear. Especially legal fear. I walked through the licensing division toward my office while rain hammered the windows hard enough to blur the river outside into gray static. Employees looked up as I passed. Some nodded. Some avoided eye contact entirely. A few already knew something was wrong. One person even stood up halfway from their desk, as if deciding whether to ask a question, then thought better of it. Smart choice. My office sat at the far end of the corridor beside the strategy archive room. Small, minimal. No decorative nonsense, one bookshelf, two monitors, an old brass desk lamp. And against the wall near the window sat 3 gray storage boxes labeled Legacy Agreements. Nobody had touched them in years. That was the funny part. Entire corporations spend millions building future growth while ignoring the fossils buried beneath them. But fossils become oil under enough pressure. I placed my bag on the desk and reopened my laptop. 3 unread emails already waited. One from Melissa, one from finance operations, and one marked urgent. Legal review requested, right on schedule. I opened it. From Office of Corporate Counsel. Subject: immediate clarification required. Licensing Appendix Section 11. Beautiful, 9 minutes exactly. I leaned back slowly. Outside my office, the hallway noise had shifted. Quieter now. People pretending to work while listening carefully for fragments of catastrophe. I clicked the attached document. The original licensing agreement appeared across the screen. 76 pages of acquisition-era emergency language written during HDG's expansion crisis 7 years earlier. Most executives currently running the company weren't even there when it was signed. But I was. I remembered every line, especially page 74, especially section 11. The clause nobody read because everyone assumed it was temporary. The clause created during the merger panic when HDG desperately needed my optimization engine integrated before shareholder review season. Back then, they promised temporary deferred compensation until restructuring stabilized. Temporary. Corporate history's favorite lie. The screen glowed softly as I scrolled downward. And there it was. Section 11, Royalty Contingency Conversion. Cold legal language, precise, merciless. If deferred compensation exceeds 36 consecutive months without negotiated settlement, licensing architect retains percentage participation rights tied to derivative revenue structures, not salary. Participation rights. That wording mattered enormously. Because my architecture no longer touched one department, it touched almost everything. Licensing, medical analytics, defense routing, international distribution, 3 acquisitions, 2 overseas partnerships, 7 infrastructure expansions. My royalty trigger had quietly spread through the company like roots beneath concrete, and nobody noticed. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I looked up. Daniel Reeves stood outside my office, senior corporate attorney, tall, precise, impossibly composed, the kind of man who spoke in complete sentences even during emergencies, which meant if he personally came downstairs, things were already bad, very bad. "Do you have a moment?" he asked. Notice the wording. Not "can we talk," not "what the hell is this?" Just, "Do you have a moment?" Lawyers become terrifyingly polite when exposure reaches catastrophic levels. "Of course," I said. Daniel entered and quietly closed the office door behind him. That tiny detail mattered. Closed doors inside corporations create immediate gravitational pull. Employees notice instantly. Across the hallway, I saw 2 managers suddenly invent reasons to stand near the printer. Daniel placed a thin folder on my desk. Red tab. Executive priority marker. Interesting. He remained standing. Counsel has reviewed the appendix. I folded my hands calmly. And? A pause. Then the sentence arrived carefully, like he was lowering unstable chemicals onto a table. The clause appears enforceable. Outside the office, somebody dropped something metal. Nobody moved afterward. People were listening. Daniel continued. There are complications regarding revenue scope. Complications again. That word was spreading through the building like smoke. I almost smiled. How large is the current exposure estimate? I asked. Another pause. Lawyers hate numbers unless numbers help them. These numbers did not help them. At present valuation, he said quietly, approximately 81 million. Even spoken softly, the number changed the room. The air itself felt heavier. $81 million. Not theoretical, not speculative, contractual. And worse, retroactive. Rain cracked hard against the windows again. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel asked the real question. Why didn't you activate the clause earlier? I looked toward the storage boxes beside the window. Legacy agreements. Dust covered. Ignored. Like promises. Because I thought the company would eventually do the right thing, I answered. That landed harder than anger would have. Daniel exhaled slowly. Somewhere upstairs, an executive assistant hurried down the hallway carrying printed folders with both arms. 2 directors emerged from a conference room whispering sharply. One sentence drifted through the corridor. Board notification threshold. So the board knew now. Excellent. Daniel lowered his voice further. There's another issue. Of course there was. The royalty structure doesn't cap at domestic revenue. There it was. The real nightmare. International licensing. Europe. Asia Pacific. Defense-adjacent analytics routing. Everything tied to the derivative framework. Years ago, executives signed the clause thinking it would never survive long enough to matter. Now the clause had matured quietly in the dark like compound interest wearing expensive shoes. I stood and walked toward the rain-covered windows. Chicago looked distant beneath the storm. Gray towers fading into mist. Beautiful city. Predatory city. A place where billion-dollar negotiations happened behind soft voices and imported carpets. Behind me, Daniel finally asked the question everyone upstairs was now asking. What do you want? I looked at my reflection in the glass. Not angry, not triumphant, just tired. 7 years tired. Then I answered. I want the company to stop treating loyalty like free infrastructure. Silence. Deep silence. The kind boardrooms fear because it sounds too reasonable to fight publicly. Daniel nodded once. Professional, measured. But I noticed something else beneath the composure. Respect. Because lawyers understand something so HR departments rarely do. The most dangerous employee in a corporation is not the loudest one. It's the person who documented everything. And upstairs, executives were beginning to understand that the woman whose raise had supposedly gotten lost in legal had quietly built legal into the architecture itself. A second later, every phone on the executive floor vibrated simultaneously with a new internal notification. Board review initiated. And somewhere beyond the storm clouds above Chicago, thunder rolled low enough to sound almost like applause. If you've ever watched a company smile while quietly undervaluing the people holding its foundations together. Subscribe now, because the most expensive corporate mistakes rarely begin with screaming. They begin with one ignored employee, one forgotten clause, and one sentence nobody should have said out loud. At 10:03 a.m., the executive floor stopped pretending everything was under control. You could see it in the assistants first. Executive assistants are the true nervous system of corporations. They know who's panicking by how fast calendar invitations get rewritten. And that morning, meetings were disappearing, reappearing, changing rooms, changing titles. Strategic alignment session, compensation review, licensing clarification. Corporate language becomes hilariously creative when people are trying to avoid writing the phrase $81 million exposure in a calendar invite. I sat quietly in my office while the building above me slowly transformed into a pressure chamber. 3 unread voicemails, 6 internal emails, 2 meeting requests marked urgent. I ignored all of them. Instead, I opened an old spreadsheet from 2019, version archive, royalty propagation map. The document looked harmless at first glance: gray cells, revenue routing, licensing percentages, integration markers. But beneath the surface, it mapped something enormous. Every acquisition HDG integrated after my framework deployment had unknowingly expanded the Section 11 structure, like roots spreading beneath a city. Nobody noticed because corporations rarely examine systems once they become profitable. Profit creates blindness, and HDG had been very profitable. A sharp knock interrupted the silence. Not polite this time, urgent. I looked up. Melissa stood outside my office again, but the HR smile was gone now. Completely gone. Interesting how fast professionalism evaporates when legal departments start using phrases like enforceable exposure. "Can we talk?" she asked. Different wording this time. Real wording. I gestured toward the chair. She entered quickly, closing the door behind her harder than intended. Tiny crack in composure. She remained standing. Bad sign. People sit when they think conversations are manageable. Counsel says the clause may trigger retroactively across multiple subsidiaries. May. Another corporate survival word. I folded my hands calmly. They're correct. Melissa stared at me for a long second. You built this. Not accusation, realization. Outside the office, the hallway had become unusually quiet again. Employees always know when history is happening nearby. I built the infrastructure, I corrected softly. The clause was built by your executives. That landed, because it was true. Years earlier, during acquisition panic, HDG leadership wanted my architecture immediately but didn't want to approve full compensation before quarterly reporting. So they delayed, deferred, restructured, recategorized. All the elegant corporate synonyms for "we'll deal with it later." And now later had arrived wearing legal authority and an $81 million invoice. Melissa rubbed her forehead. You could destroy this company. There it was, the emotional pivot. Not "we treated you unfairly," not "we made a mistake," just fear of consequences. I looked toward the rain beyond the windows. The storm had darkened the skyline so heavily that neighboring towers looked half erased inside the clouds. No, I said quietly. The company is doing that part itself. Silence, deep enough to hear the air vents. Melissa finally sat down. For the first time since entering, she looked human instead of corporate. Tired eyes, controlled breathing, mascara slightly smudged beneath one eye from stress. Not villainous, just trapped inside a machine that rewarded short-term optics over long-term respect. I didn't know, she admitted. And strangely, I believed her. HR departments inherit decisions the way new tenants inherit cracks in old buildings. Most of them never see the structural damage until the walls start moving. A notification appeared on my laptop screen. Confidential. Board council request. Things were escalating quickly now. Melissa noticed the notification color and visibly stiffened. Dark red priority marker. Board level. That meant outside counsel was probably already involved. Expensive people in expensive suits entering expensive conference rooms to discuss expensive mistakes. Corporate weather forecasting. I opened the message. A short line appeared. Do not communicate externally regarding royalty structures until review concludes. I laughed softly. Melissa looked exhausted already. What's funny now? They still think this is about containment, because executives always believe disasters are public relations problems first, not structural problems, not ethical problems, not contractual problems, image problems. That illusion usually survives right until lawyers begin protecting themselves individually. And once self-preservation begins, executive unity dies very quickly. Another email arrived, then another. My inbox was becoming a battlefield. Finance, counsel, operations, someone from investor relations. Interesting. Investor relations only gets involved when numbers become dangerous enough to affect confidence. That meant estimates were spreading upward fast. Melissa stared at the old spreadsheet still open on my screen. What exactly does the royalty structure touch? I rotated the monitor slightly toward her. She scanned the integration tree, then scanned it again, slower. I watched the exact moment understanding hit. Her face lost color. Oh my God! Yes, exactly. The framework no longer touched one product line. It touched the entire ecosystem. Every international licensing branch built on top of my optimization layer fed percentages into the dormant clause structure. And because the contract used derivative revenue language, expansion increased exposure automatically. 7 years of expansion. 7 years of acquisitions. 7 years of executives congratulating themselves during earnings calls, all while dragging an invisible chain behind them. Melissa whispered the next sentence almost involuntarily. They never read the appendix. No, I said. They read the quarterly projections. That one hurt, because corporations often confuse intelligence with momentum. If profits rise, nobody questions architecture. Nobody checks buried obligations. Nobody asks whether the person quietly maintaining the machine has already built escape routes into the system. A sudden commotion erupted farther down the hallway. Voices, fast footsteps. Then silence again. Melissa turned toward the glass wall instinctively. 2 senior executives passed quickly with legal folders in hand. Neither looked at my office. That told me everything. When executives avoid eye contact entirely, internal blame allocation has already started, and blame inside corporations spreads faster than fire, especially among people protecting bonuses. Melissa stood slowly. Board counsel wants you upstairs. Of course they do. She hesitated near the door, then asked the first honest question all morning. Did you know this would happen? Rain streaked down the windows behind her like liquid silver. I thought carefully before answering. No, I said. I knew the clause existed. A pause. But I underestimated how long arrogance could delay consequences. That stayed with her. I could see it because deep down she understood the truth now. This wasn't really a legal disaster. It was accumulated disrespect finally reaching maturity. Corporate interest compounded over time, the most expensive kind. Melissa opened the office door. The hallway outside instantly became performatively busy again. Printers, folders, coffee cups. People acting with Oscar-level commitment to not listening. Before leaving, she looked back once, and for the first time since entering that conference room earlier that morning, there was no HR tone left in her voice at all, just quiet disbelief. All this over a raise. I picked up my laptop calmly. No, I replied. All this because they thought I would stay silent forever. And upstairs, somewhere beyond layers of glass, marble, and executive compensation packages, the board of Halbrecht Dynamics had just begun asking the most dangerous question any corporation can ask during a crisis. Who else knew? The boardroom on the 32nd floor looked exactly like the kind of room where people convinced themselves they controlled the world. Floor-to-ceiling windows, dark walnut walls. A 12-meter table polished so perfectly it reflected the ceiling lights like still water. And seated around it were the architects of modern corporate confidence. Executives who believed enough meetings could solve almost anything. Until contracts started answering back. When I entered, conversations stopped instantly. Not gradually, not awkwardly, completely. Interesting how silence changes texture depending on who owns the leverage. At the far end of the table sat Halbrecht Dynamics CEO Richard Halbrecht himself. Silver hair, navy suit, controlled posture. The kind of man financial magazines describe as disciplined, while employees describe him differently in private. Beside him sat outside counsel, 3 attorneys, which meant internal legal no longer trusted itself alone. Excellent sign. A storm-dark skyline stretched behind them through the glass walls, turning the entire room gray-blue, like the inside of an approaching wave. Richard folded his hands slowly. Camille. No smile, no corporate warmth. We had moved beyond theater now. I placed my laptop on the table and sat without invitation. Tiny detail. Several executives noticed immediately. Power in boardrooms often reveals itself through microscopic violations of etiquette. No one corrected me. Also interesting. To Richard's left, CFO Martin Keller looked like a man calculating how many future earnings calls this disaster might survive. Not many. One outside attorney opened a folder carefully. We've reviewed the licensing appendix. I nodded. And? A pause. Always pauses now. Everyone in the building suddenly loved pauses. The royalty trigger appears valid under current compensation timelines. There it was again. Appears valid. Corporate legal language for we are absolutely in trouble but would still like theoretical escape routes. Richard finally spoke. Why was this never disclosed to current leadership? I almost admired the audacity. Not why wasn't this resolved? Not why was compensation delayed for years? Just, why weren't we warned? Executives often interpret forgotten accountability as betrayal. I leaned back calmly. It was disclosed. Silence. Martin frowned. No one here has seen this clause before. Then someone failed to read the acquisition archive. That landed hard. Because buried beneath the tension sat an ugly truth. The documents existed. The signatures existed. The reminders existed. They simply stopped paying attention once revenue started climbing. Outside, thunder rolled across the skyline, low and distant. One attorney adjusted his glasses. The projected exposure could materially impact quarterly guidance. Could. Another survival word. I opened my laptop slowly and rotated the screen toward them. Royalty propagation map, international revenue tree, licensing expansion chains, color-coded dependency structures branching across the screen like neural pathways. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Martin whispered, "Jesus Christ." Yes. Now they understood. The royalty participation structure had spread into nearly every profitable branch created after the original integration. Europe, Asia Pacific, defense analytics, medical licensing, 3 mergers, multiple derivative systems. Every expansion multiplied exposure. And because the clause contained no revenue ceiling, the longer they ignored it, the larger it became. Compound negligence, the most expensive investment strategy imaginable. Richard's jaw tightened almost invisibly. When exactly were you planning to enforce this? Never, I answered honestly. That surprised them. Good. Because truth becomes disorienting inside rooms designed around strategic manipulation. The attorney looked up sharply. Then why now? I met his eyes. Because your HR department informed me this morning that my raise got lost in legal. Silence. Real silence again. Not one person moved. Not even slightly. The sentence sounded different in this room now. Heavier, stupider. Like hearing the first domino hit after finally noticing how long the line really is. Martin slowly removed his glasses. You activated an $81 million clause over a compensation meeting? No, I said calmly. Your company activated it when it crossed the contractual threshold last year. Another pause. Then I added softly, this morning was simply the first time someone said it out loud. That one cut deep. Because everybody at the table suddenly realized the same thing simultaneously. The disaster had already existed, hidden, accumulating, waiting. Today merely exposed it. Richard stood and walked toward the windows overlooking Chicago. Rain distorted the city lights into silver streaks across the glass. For a moment, he looked older than I remembered. Not weak, just exhausted in the particular way executives become exhausted when certainty abandons them. You built critical infrastructure for this company, he said quietly without turning around. Yes. And nobody thought to secure permanent ownership. No. One of the outside attorneys closed his folder carefully. That motion alone told me negotiations were about to replace denial. The room had crossed the invisible line. Executives stop arguing once probability collapses. Now they wanted damage control. Richard turned back slowly. What do you want? Again that question, but this time it sounded different. Not defensive. Careful, because power had shifted. Not publicly yet, not permanently, but enough. I looked around the boardroom, at the polished table, the skyline, the carefully framed leadership awards along the walls. Every symbol corporations build to convince themselves permanence exists. Then I answered, I want acknowledgement. Confusion flickered across several faces. One attorney frowned slightly. Acknowledgement of what? I folded my hands. That systems don't build themselves. The room stayed silent. So I continued. For 7 years, this company treated infrastructure like magic. I gestured lightly toward the royalty map glowing across the screen. People celebrated revenue while ignoring the people who built the mechanisms generating it. Martin stared down at the numbers again. Probably recalculating executive bonus impacts. Interesting species, CFOs. Even during existential crises, part of their brain still runs spreadsheets automatically. Richard spoke carefully. We can negotiate settlement terms. There it was. Finally. Not dismissal, not HR language, reality. I nodded once. Yes. One of the attorneys leaned forward. However, there's concern regarding external disclosure risk. Of course there was. Always image first, always reputation first. I almost smiled. You still think the dangerous part is public exposure? The attorney's expression hardened slightly. And it isn't. I looked around the room slowly. No. I tapped the royalty map softly. The dangerous part is that every senior engineer in this company is watching how you handle this. That changed the atmosphere immediately, because suddenly this wasn't one contractual dispute anymore. It was precedent, culture, retention, trust, things shareholders love hearing about in keynote speeches and almost never fund properly. Outside, lightning flashed bright enough to wash the boardroom white for half a second. Then darkness settled back across the glass. Martin spoke next, quieter than before. If this becomes public, recruitment damage alone could... It already became public internally. I interrupted gently. Another painful silence, because they knew I was right. Hallways were already vibrating with rumors. Finance teams were talking. Legal teams were whispering. Engineers were checking archived agreements. And somewhere deep in the building, employees who had spent years feeling invisible were beginning to realize something intoxicating. The machine was not invincible. Richard finally returned to his chair. For the first time all morning, he looked directly at me without executive performance layered over his expression. Just honesty. Rare thing in boardrooms. We made a mistake, he admitted. Simple sentence. But inside corporations, simple sentences cost fortunes. I studied him quietly for a moment, then nodded once. Yes, I said. You did. And beyond the rain-soaked windows of Chicago, thunder rolled again across the skyline while downstairs, employees refreshed internal forums fast enough to crash part of the company intranet for 6 straight minutes. Because rumors had finally evolved into something much larger. Hope. By Friday morning, the entire company had changed its posture. Not officially. Officially, Halbrecht Dynamics released a carefully polished internal statement about ongoing contractual reconciliation discussions and long-term infrastructure recognition initiatives. Classic corporate language. The kind written by 6 attorneys and 3 communications consultants trying desperately to make panic sound strategic. But employees weren't reading the statement anymore. They were reading each other. Break rooms became quieter. Slack channels became louder. Engineers who normally avoided eye contact in elevators were suddenly discussing contract language over coffee like underground revolutionaries with access badges. And somewhere between legal review meetings and emergency board calls, an uncomfortable realization had spread across the company. The invisible people had started paying attention to their own value. That terrified leadership far more than my royalty clause ever did. I arrived at headquarters just before 8 a.m. Rain had finally stopped overnight, leaving Chicago washed silver beneath cold spring sunlight. The glass towers downtown reflected the morning sky so brightly, it almost hurt to look at them. Funny city. It always looked cleanest right after storms. Inside the lobby, conversations lowered when I walked past. Not dramatically, subtly. Respect mixed with curiosity. The security guard near reception gave me a small nod, usually reserved for executives. Interesting promotion. Upstairs, my inbox contained 73 unread emails, 42 from internal employees. Most weren't about money. That was the surprising part. They were about exhaustion, recognition, years of temporary delays, deferred bonuses, silent burnout. One message simply read, "Thank you for proving we weren't imagining it." That one stayed with me, because corporations rarely collapse from single scandals. They erode slowly through accumulated dismissals, tiny moments, ignored contributions, promises postponed until employees stop distinguishing between patience and surrender. At 8:14 a.m., Daniel Reeves from Council appeared outside my office again, this time without the red folder, without emergency posture, just coffee in one hand and visible fatigue beneath his eyes. "Board approved the settlement framework," he said. I gestured toward the chair. He sat carefully. The building outside my office sounded different today. Not panicked anymore. Alert. Alive. As if the company itself had realized something irreversible happened this week. Daniel slid a document across the desk. Final terms. Compensation settlement. Royalty restructuring. Infrastructure attribution rights. Governance review provisions. And beneath everything else sat the number everyone had been orbiting for 48 straight hours. $81 million. Strange thing about enormous numbers. Once they become real, they stop feeling cinematic. They start feeling heavy. Daniel watched me quietly. "No victory speech?" he asked. I almost smiled. This doesn't feel like victory. Because it didn't. Winning against your own company feels strangely hollow, like surviving a building collapse only to realize you still remember where the furniture used to be. Outside the windows, sunlight finally broke fully across the skyline. For the first time all week, the city no longer looked submerged beneath storm clouds. Daniel leaned back slightly. "You know," he said carefully, "the board expected you to go public." "Why?" "Most people would." I looked down at the agreement again, then toward the hallway where employees moved between meetings carrying laptops, coffee cups, exhaustion, ambition, the ordinary machinery of working life. "No," I said quietly. "Most people just want to be treated fairly before they reach their breaking point." That silenced him for a moment, because underneath lawsuits, clauses, negotiations, and exposure reports sat a simpler truth nobody upstairs wanted to admit publicly. This entire disaster could have been prevented by one honest raise discussion years ago. One conversation. One acknowledgement. Instead, the company spent years optimizing compensation spreadsheets while accidentally creating an $81 million lesson in corporate arrogance. Expensive education. Daniel stood slowly. "There's one more thing." Of course there was. He hesitated near the door. "The board wants to create a new executive oversight position tied to infrastructure governance." I raised an eyebrow. "And?" "They want you to lead it." There it was. The final corporate instinct. When the system breaks, offer leadership to the person who warned you about the weakness. I stared out at Chicago again. Morning traffic moved below like streams of silver light between the towers. For a moment, I thought about the younger version of myself entering this company 7 years earlier, carrying impossible optimism and an underpriced contract. Back then, I believed talent automatically created security. But corporations don't reward silence consistently. They reward leverage, and leverage without boundaries eventually becomes exploitation wearing business casual. "Will you accept?" Daniel asked. I looked at the settlement papers once more, then at the storage boxes beside my office wall. Legacy agreements, dust-covered history, forgotten warnings, ignored promises. Finally, I closed the folder gently. Click. Same sound my laptop made inside that conference room days earlier. Small sound. Massive consequences. "I'll consider it," I said. Daniel nodded once and left quietly. Outside my office, employees pretended not to watch him walk away. Poor actors. A moment later, my screen lit up with a new internal notification, visible company-wide. Infrastructure Compensation Review Initiative approved. And just like that, the building changed again. You could almost feel it, not fear this time. Possibility. Engineers forwarding the announcement privately. Managers suddenly scheduling overdue compensation reviews. Executives discovering empathy immediately after legal exposure. Amazing how fast corporate culture evolves once accountability becomes expensive. I stood and walked toward the windows, overlooking downtown Chicago. Sunlight reflected across the glass towers like fire. Somewhere below, thousands of employees hurried through crosswalks carrying coffees, laptops, unfinished ambitions. Entire careers moving through cities built by invisible people. Invisible until something stops working. My phone vibrated one last time. A message from Melissa in HR. Just one sentence. "You were right about legal." I laughed quietly, then typed back, "No, legal was right about value." And for the first time all week, the silence inside Halbrecht Dynamics no longer sounded dangerous. It sounded awake,